Hello, I'm Tootight Lautrec, and welcome back to Glitterature Alley, your back street off the beaten path, under the radar, and beyond the pale place to sparkle up your senses while we talk about all things literary. And while this is an episode of Glitterature Alley, we've actually moved over to the Shaky Sonnet Show environs under doctor's orders, because we're filming a lot of the Shaky Sonnet Show episodes, but I thought I'd squeeze in one last Glitterature Alley before we start the season sometime in January. And today we're going to be talking about John Milton's Paradise Lost. And I am reading Paradise Lost because I just finished reading Marilynne Robinson's book, Jack, her new novel. And I won't talk about this at all except to say, spoiler alert, it's wonderful. But there's a lot of talk in here about Paradise Lost and many other things. There are a lot of literary references throughout. But it made me, while I was reading it, think I should reread Milton's Paradise Lost. And indeed, that's what I'm going to do. So I know that Roz at Scally Dandelion About the Books is going to be doing a buddy read with a bunch of other booktubers at some point in the future. And while they are going to, I'm sure, have a much more comprehensive discussion with a much more insightful reading than I'll be able to give in one sitting, I thought I'd just give you a rough overview of my reading experience of Paradise Lost. And also, since we're on the all the biblical themes, I also wanted to talk about Tom at LA Books, who's going to be doing, or he is doing, a reading of all 100 cantos of Dante's Divine Comedy. So I will talk about that a little bit more at the end, but it's wonderful. And if you can find that, I'll link it below, and I'll link Roz's channel below also. So, Paradise Lost, and this is a rough overview of my reading experience. In general, it's made up of 12 books, they're called, and each book took me about an hour to read. If by an hour you mean 10 minutes of reading, half an hour of napping, and then another 50 to 60 minutes of reading. If you want to call that an hour, that's an hour, and each book took me about an hour to read. Once I was up from my nap, I plowed through it as if it were prose, and to tell you the truth, it was a bit of a slog, interspersed with bits of brilliance. But I will say, big snaps to Milton for having the chutzpah to even tell this Judeo-Christian origin story in the form of an epic poem. So he uses Homer and Virgil as his models for epic poetry, but I do have a problem with that because it doesn't quite work in this particular, or for this particular story, because with Homer and Virgil, they would use similes to compare, say, the marching of armies, or a deed of a hero, or even something beautiful, and they would compare it to attributes in the natural world or in the geographical world in order to augment their awesomeness. And in Milton, it's a bit of a stretch simply because he has to excuse all of his similes because he's comparing things to things in the uncreated world. At the time this is being told, the world has not yet been created, so he has to kind of stretch all of his similes, and they fall a little flat for me. He is at his best, though, when describing the in-between realms, when the rebel angels are falling out of heaven through chaos into hell, or when Satan is roaming the uncreated earth, or with the battles of the angels, and he's particularly good at physical transformations, which is, obviously he's taken a page out of Ovid's Metamorphoses, and he's done very well in that regard. So in creating this new version of the Judeo-Christian creation story, Milton takes some liberties, and I've learned quite a few things from the liberties that he's taken. And spoiler alert, I will say some things that even though we know that Adam and Eve are thrust out of heaven in Paradise Lost, I will be talking about things that, in the way that it's told, that if you don't want to know all the intimate details of Milton's particular version, then just be forewarned. I'm going to talk about a lot. But so in Milton's version, I found out that Sin is actually Satan's daughter, and she was born out of Satan's head. She kind of just burst out from his head one day, as Athena did from Zeus. And Death is Sin's son from an incestuous relationship with her father, Satan. So Sin is Satan's daughter, and Death is Satan's son and grandson. That was interesting. So we also learn a lot about other things, like, for instance, that angels eat like humans and apparently shit gold is what I took from the passage. And at one point when the angel is telling Adam not to be too horny, basically, or to eat too much, just like when you eat too much, you get a lot of gas. So we learn that from Milton. And we get the answer to the age-old question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And according to Milton, it's the egg in Book 7, line 48. But the passage that drew me to reread Paradise Lost from Marilyn Robinson's Jack is that Adam asks the angel Raphael how angels have sex. And Adam says, the term he uses for having sex is, do they mix irradiance? And that's in Book 8. And that, of course, sent me into a tizzy, and I had to read Paradise Lost after that point in Jack. So the main characters of Paradise Lost are God, sure, of course, Jesus, yeah, all right, and the angels, yeah, of course. But the main characters are Satan and Adam and Eve. Now, Satan is a pretty interesting character because, yes, he's evil, but he's also he's kind of cool, and he has a conscience. And I'm just going to read to you this point where he gets to Earth to find Adam and Eve, and he's on his mission to get his revenge. And we get this, that Satan begins his dire attempt, which nigh the birth now rolling boils in his tumultuous breast, and like a devilish engine back recoils upon himself. Horror and doubt distract his troubled thoughts, and from the bottom stir the hell within him. For within him hell he brings, and round about him, nor from hell one step no more than from himself can fly by change of place. Now conscience wakes despair that slumbered, wakes the bitter memory of what he was, what is, and what must be. So that's pretty chilling. And it's also chilling to know that that is Satan's awareness of he did have heaven and he messed it all up, and now he's in hell, and he's aware of that loss all the time. And so you understand his anger, but you also understand what a fool he was to have given all of that up. So Adam is sort of a kind of a big dumb lunk as far as I'm concerned, but the way that Milton draws him is as this perfect man, and he describes him at one point when the angel comes down. Adam goes out to meet him, and Milton describes who he calls our primitive great sire, Adam. Meanwhile, our primitive great sire, to meet his godlike guest, walks forth without more train accompanied than with his own complete perfections. So Adam gets up and walks around with nothing but his own complete perfections, and he's you know, the man of the hour. And then comes Eve, and this is where I have a problem. I'm going to just read a few descriptions of Eve to you by Milton, you know, supposedly through the voice of whatever muse he's working with. Eve, and he is Adam and she is Eve. For contemplation he and valor formed, for softness she and sweet attractive grace. He for God only, she for God in him. And then at one point, Eve says to Adam, "My author and disposer, what thou bidst, unargued I obey. So God ordains. God is thy law, thou mine. To know no more is woman's happiest knowledge and their praise." And we also get this description of Eve. "For nothing lovelier can be found in woman than to study household good and good works in her husband to promote." And of course, she gets called much later on, much failing, hapless Eve. So I think you get the picture here. And now, I don't find this distasteful only, this kind of misogyny distasteful only because it's really gross, and it is. I find it distasteful because weak, dumb characters don't make for good stories. And I don't blame this on the Bible. I blame it on Milton. Milton was born in 1608, the year before the 1609 quarto version of Shakespeare's sonnets came out. So he was born after Shakespeare. He was born after Chaucer. He was born after Homer and after Virgil, all of whom knew the benefits of having strong, intelligent female characters in the mix because it makes for a much better story. So the story itself gets bogged down in places because there's a lot of exposition parading as dialogue between the Archangel Raphael and Adam, talking about the origins of everything. And apparently Raphael wasn't there when Adam was born, so Adam has to tell him how he came to be, even though he doesn't really know. He says, "How can a person tell what they were before they were born? But I'll give it a good shot," and he does. So the basic thrust is that the encapsulating story is that God creates Jesus and makes him Lord over the heavens. And Satan gets jealous. Satan rebels, enlists 1/3 of heaven to fight against them. They lose, are cast into hell. God creates the earth and Adam and Eve in order to repopulate heaven from the 1/3 that he lost when he cast out Satan and all his friends. And Satan's revenge is to go to this new place, Earth or Eden, where these new beings are, Adam and Eve, and attempt to pervert them to his will. So that's the basic story, and we get a lot of that through the 12 books. But the best part is book 9, which is where the big betrayal happens. Now, the main prohibition is don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But Eve isn't even told this directly. The Archangel Raphael tells this to Adam and says, "Tell Eve, she's out preparing the meal, as she should be, because she's subservient and not as smart as you, and I don't really have to tell her, you tell her." So she isn't even given the main prohibition to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So they're in Eden. They're out gardening one day, as they do, because they have to do it. It's the garden, and you have to garden. And Adam's all like, "Oh, poor dumb Eve, you're inferior to me and not as smart as I am, but you're so pretty." And Eve is kind of like, "Okay, I think I need a little alone time. There's a lot to do here. You go off and do your gardening, and I'll go off and do my gardening, and we'll get it done a lot faster." He's like, "Oh no, but you're so pretty, and just stay with me." And she's like, I need to go off and do this by myself." And he's like, "Well, I don't allow it. I don't allow you to do it." She's like, "Well, really, I think you should, because it'll be better for both of us if I go off by myself and do some gardening." And so then he's like, "Well, okay, I will allow you to do that." But the jealous lover that he is, even though there's nobody else on earth, says, "Don't go doing anything you're not supposed to do. And don't go, he doesn't say talking to anybody, but we get the gist of what's going on." So Eve wanders off, and Satan comes in as Satan, and he slithers his way into the body of a snake and embodies the snake. And in a very sexual scene, you've got this erect snake convincing Eve that this is what she really needs, is this erect snake right now. And he tells her, I know that they told you don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because they said that you would die, but I ate from it and I'm not dead. And in fact, not only am I not dead, but I'm a snake and I'm talking to you in your language. How about that? I think they don't want you to eat from it because if you eat from it, you'll be godlike as they are, and you have nothing to lose from it. And she says, well, I really shouldn't. But then she's like, it really does look good. The fruit looks good, and it smells kind of good. And he's like, eat. She says, okay. She eats. So she eats, and it's as if she's drunk, as if she's just had some wine. She goes back and she tells Adam. And Adam's like, oh, you really shouldn't have done that. I told you not to do that. She's like, no, really, because think about it, Adam. It's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So if we know about good and evil, if we know about good, then we can be better. And if we know about evil, then we know how to avoid it. So really, it's fine. And I ate from it and I'm not dead. So he's like, okay. So he goes and eats from it. He gets a little drunk. And then they have the best sex of their lives. Toes curling, juices squirting. It's great. It's this raucous, rousing sex that just like they've never had before. And then comes the morning after, where they're kind of like, oh, what happened last night? And they have to go and get their fig leaves. And after that comes strong recriminations between Adam and Eve, and they start fighting with each other, which is also very entertaining. And Adam says to Eve at one point, they're really like cutting with each other too. It's like they really go for the jugular. So Adam says to Eve at line 1067 to 1068 in book 9, O Eve, in evil hour thou didst give ear to that false worm. So we learn that Eve gives good ear. Another great moment is when Satan goes back to hell and he expects applause, but he goes back and he tells him, he's like, guess what I just did? I just screwed up everything for God. I got my revenge. I made the mortals eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and I did it with just a stupid apple, so it just makes it even better. And he tells this, and he stands up, and he's waiting for his applause, and we get this in book 10, line 504 to 520, and he's really, really proud of himself, and he's waiting for his applause. So having said, a while he stood, expecting their universal shout and high applause to fill his ear, when contrary, he hears on all sides from innumerable tongues a dismal universal hiss, the sound of public scorn. He wondered, but not long had leisure, wondering at himself now more. His visage drawn he felt to sharp and spare. His arms clung to his ribs, his legs entwining each other, till supplanted down he fell, a monstrous serpent on his belly, prone. Reluctant, but in vain. A greater power now ruled him, punished in the shape he sinned, according to his doom. He would have spoke, but hiss for hiss returned with forked tongue to forked tongue. For now all were transformed alike to serpents. So that's just an amazingly wonderful transformation scene. And Milton is at the height of his powers at this point. It's really wonderful. So all the devils are hissing and flopping around on the floor, but apparently it's only for one day a year that they'll turn into snakes. Then they turn back into whatever gloriously demonic beings that they are. And the rest of the book is simply a retelling of the Old Testament. We've got Noah, we've got Moses, we've got Jesus, we've got the promise of man's salvation, and again, shown only to Adam. The angel puts Eve to sleep and says, you can tell her about this later, but I'm going to show you all this. And it ends kind of hopefully, because although the angel is showing this to Adam and saying, you really messed up, you really messed up. But everything's going to turn out okay. And then we get the very last lines of the book, which I'm going to read to you, which I find really, really beautiful. So although Adam and Eve have screwed up, they're leaving Eden, but they're going to be entering into the world that we, as flawed human beings, are living in today, apparently. Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them. Which I'm just going to say, that's a wonderful, just the idea the world was all before them. Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them. Where to choose the place of rest, and Providence their guide, they, hand in hand, with wandering steps and slow, through Eden, took their solitary way. And I find that so moving. It's so beautiful, and it is quite hopeful. And so, do I recommend this book? Absolutely, I recommend this book. But if you're going to be reading Paradise Lost, and if you're going to be reading Marilynne Robinson's Jack, I would suggest reading Paradise Lost first, just so that you get a flavor for what she's talking about in the sections where she does reference this. And I wouldn't mind seeing a booktuber. She talks about a lot of things in here. I would love to see a booktuber talk about all the literary references in Jack. She talks about Hamlet. She talks about, I think, William Carlos Williams. She talks about Paul Dunbar, all kinds of things. And so it would be great if we had some kind of a booktuber talking about all those literary references. But one thing I will say is that it's not as good as Dante's Divine Comedy. And I'll once again refer you to Tom at LA Books and his channel below, where he's going to be looking, every week he's going to be looking at each one of the 100 cantos of Dante's Divine Comedy, which is a huge project. And I'm into it because obviously I'm into my own huge project of looking at all 154 Shakespeare sonnets. So follow along with Tom and Dante, and follow along with me and Shakespeare while I present the 154 sonnets, which I probably will start in January. And until we meet again, just know that Milton knew that the world was full of wonder. Dante knew it, Virgil knew it, Homer knew it, Shakespeare knew it, and Marilynne Robinson absolutely knows it. And what do? They paid attention. So take the hint. Until we meet again, I'm Tootight Lautrec. Mwah.